Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Whether it's cybersecurity, plant floor safety, data management, or a number of other things pertaining to the industrial enterprise, it's always good to start with the simple stuff, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, or the basics. Well, when looking at industrial cybersecurity, this should mean greater attention being paid to how workers are logging into to access critical machinery, software, or data. Because right now, we're doing a lot of the little things rather poorly, and the hackers know it. According to TrustWave Threat Intelligence's recent Manufacturing Threat Landscape report, 45% of attacks experienced by manufacturers stem from the bad guys accessing credentials. Whether by utilizing brute force tactics, submitting fake support tickets, or just purchasing logins on the dark web, this seems to prove that the hackers would much rather log into your networks than break in. The report also cited the rise of initial access brokers, or groups that focus specifically on obtaining and selling login data to other hackers. One example cited by TrustWave saw an IAB offering access to a leading steel manufacturer for the price of just over $60,000. These credentials reportedly would provide access to a remote desktop account, an administrative account, a VPN account, and additional remote access capabilities. The $60,000 investment could be used to extort millions from an unsuspecting or poorly defended manufacturer. And unfortunately, this is not a unique circumstance, which is why I'm excited to welcome David Cottingham to the show. He's the president of RFIDs, a leading provider of security and authentication products and services. David, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. We're going to get into talking a lot about credentials and secure access and all that, but I thought maybe a good place to start would be with people. We've got this expanding attack surface. We've got more of these connections throughout the industrial enterprise, and we can throw all the tools and strategies we want at it. At the end of the day, we need to have the right people understanding the right things to carry forward our cybersecurity strategies. So I'd be interested in getting your take a little bit on how that attitude internally has evolved in embracing and getting people on board with cybersecurity, and what you've seen there, experienced in helping folks out.
Well, you're right. People do sit at the middle of all these processes. There's only so much that we can automate, but it comes down to if someone makes a decision or clicks on something they perhaps shouldn't, then you've got a problem. And so what we've seen evolve over time is trying to make that as easy as possible for people to remain compliant. That's one of the areas that we've always focused our business at RFIDs, is that all of our Wave ID products, we're all about facilitating rapid, secure access to information. We found over time that if you force people into just constant user ID and password, they're going to get fatigued. And that's because people deal with 27 passwords, right, in their work life, which is incredible. But you start to add that up and you're like, oh, yeah, I probably do, right? At first you hear that number and you're like, that can't be. And when you get to 27 passwords, then you start to fall into some of these bad behaviors of reusing passwords, or, God forbid, you're putting it on a Post-it note somewhere, right? We still hear that from customers. I was talking to one of our partners recently that's in a healthcare vertical, and they were talking to a hospital that was congratulating themselves for having moved away from that to at least user ID password. They were on shared passwords and they went to user ID password. So we still see lots of incidents where people are in the middle of that. So we need to find ways to make it easy, efficient, and yet secure for them to do so. Because if we don't, then they'll fall back into some of those bad habits. And just one of the other things that I've seen evolve is, I think there was maybe an attitude 5 years ago that there was almost a punitive approach to how we addressed it with people. And that doesn't work. We have to make them our partner in this process. And we need to make sure that if you are observing anomalous behavior on a machine, on the shop floor, or on your laptop, you need to raise your hand and say, I think something's going on here, as opposed to saying, gee, I may have clicked on something, responded to something, I don't want to get in trouble. Then you've got a worst case scenario where that attack may continue to grow instead of getting that information early. So you need to make people a partner.
No, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think that is sort of a shift throughout the industry. We don't want to punish people and focus more on the educational element of it, still reinforcing the fact that, man, you can't click on that link in that email or whatever the case may be.
That's
So,
right.
there's a lot that we can dive into, and I want to get into in terms of credentials and being smart with passwords and all of that. To start off the conversation there, David, what are some of the bigger trends you're seeing there and helping us to get better in protecting that logon type information?
Probably the biggest trend that we see right now is the move towards passwordless, which when you first hear that term, you're struggling a little bit to even understand, well, how can that be? But what we're talking about are technologies or a technology, for example, like FIDO2, where you're using keyed infrastructure to eliminate the need for that user ID password. And you can get to a passwordless solution using technologies like a FIDO card or a FIDO credential inside of a mobile device, which we'll probably discuss later. Combine that with a PIN, and now you're no longer using a user ID password, and you have a very secure, kind of non-phishable connection, which is what's key in that. So that's one of the big trends we see. I think we're all hearing already that you should definitely use two factors. So if you're not ready to go to a technology like passwordless, then at a minimum, you should use a second factor. And that's where we will commonly see our application deployed, where there's a user ID password and then the ID badge, or sometimes a mobile, can be used as that second factor. And that's vital to make sure at least you've got two-factor authentication in place.
Yeah, the DFA, I mean, you get a lot of appreciation and understanding from the managers, the front level security folks who want to implement that. But the folks on the front line just start rolling their eyes, especially in manufacturing, because it slows them down. It's one
right.
more thing.
Yep.
Have you seen different practices or approaches, or how would you sort of approach folks in trying to get them to embrace this and understand how important it really is?
I think the way to approach that is, again, going back to that people thing. I hear exactly what you're saying, and we hear this. I've heard repeatedly, simple things like, there's no way we're going to take a mobile device out on the shop floor, right? We get that, right? You would not do that from a productivity standpoint. You've got personal device questions you may not want to have depending on the type of staff. I think the way to get to it initially is to walk in there and to start to think about technologies like, with Bluetooth. So you could have, we see some people that don't want to deploy, obviously, a mobile device. You can use Bluetooth in a walk up, walk away sort of way. So we will see that at times where, as a second factor, you can have someone walk up with a Bluetooth fob or a Bluetooth dongle to give that location sensing. So that's one way that you can get, a little bit more of that second factor inserted into it, is using a technology like Bluetooth.
No, it makes sense. And you've brought up mobile devices. I think that's a key part of this conversation as well. So we can dive into that a little bit. I think what we've seen, and you can definitely jump in here on what you're observing as well, the higher level, the larger enterprises have gotten away from that sort of bring your own device concept in. They've gotten more dedicated in terms of the technology they're using there. But man, we've still got 75% of U.S. manufacturers would fall into that small to medium sized. And there we are seeing folks bringing in their personal tablet, their personal phone, whatever it can be, because it's easier, it's faster, all the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What advice, what kind of observations have you made in terms of trying to get away from that? If you're going to go that route, how can you make it more secure? What are some best practices maybe there in sort of getting after that BYOD dynamic that's still in place in a lot of instances?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely right. You have to recognize there's a reality that if you are in, from a number standpoint, that is absolutely the largest number of manufacturer sites are those smaller businesses, and they're not in a position where they're probably going to take on a large scale company owned device. And that, because that comes with a whole other set of problems as well, whether it's how do you manage them, and then how do you manage personal activity on a company-owned device. So what we have seen done in our industry successfully is, if someone does bring a personal device, you can deploy mobile device management software to kind of manage and contain what they have access to while they're using that personal device. So if you are using personal devices, that's where I would go, is with some sort of an MDM platform. That can have its challenges, because then you're deploying a piece of software or an application onto a personal device. So you have to strike this balance between that convenience of allowing someone to bring a personal device, but now I have a company app, for example, that's been deployed on here. So that will at times cause people to pause and think about personal devices.
No, great point. The perception is during everything that went on with COVID and during the pandemic, there was so much more remote work being done. Manufacturing was no exception from a plant management perspective. There's a lot being done through remote access. The overarching thought is we've gotten better in terms of not only installing that technology, but securing it. Are you seeing that as well? Do we still have some flaws there in terms of our remote access security, or have we kind of caught up?
Well, I think we still have flaws, and we still have a long ways to go in all these things. And that I say that across the board, just because the threats continue to evolve. And so even if you think you've got, something done, this is an industry where there will never be a plant the flag, declare victory, and move on, because the threats just keep evolving, right? It just becomes a bigger and bigger problem. I think people are doing a much better job of deploying technologies like VPN, right? I think we were in a spot where people weren't doing that. So we've probably, from a remote work standpoint, we have better use of VPN technologies and understanding how that needs to be done. But there's still, a lot of risk. We hear about incidents where people are joining public Wi-Fi and not turning on the VPN. So you may have the VPN client sit there, but if you don't have it on, it doesn't do any good. So I think there's a lot of risk there still. And that's why we go back to some of our technologies that are non-phishable, like a secure ID card, a secure credential inside of a mobile wallet, or a passwordless technology that can protect against those things.
Absolutely. I want to throw a couple things at you, because we've had some guests on the show that have been very critical of VPNs, firewalls, password managers, things like that. I've got my own opinion on it, but I kind of like to get yours, because some people look at these as solutions. Some people look at them as vulnerabilities in and of themselves. Where do you lie in terms of maybe the application of those types of tools?
I think it's really difficult to say that one of those is the answer, and not the answer. I guess I won't opine on password wallets and whether they are or not a good thing. I think the vulnerabilities there are documented, but by the flip side, you could say, well, at least it's allowing people to think about using many different passwords, which is better than a single password. So there's progress there. I think VPNs, again, are better than not having a VPN. So I think all these things, it's best to use them in coordination with each other. But no single one is the answer, and they all come with continued education and deployment of, telling people these are the behaviors that you can do maybe in a trusted environment, versus if you're on public Wi-Fi, you have to turn that VPN on. But none of them are a single silver bullet.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get into trouble with a lot of those things. It's sort of an over-reliance on any one particular approach. Everything's always evolving. The attack landscape is evolving. The hackers are evolving. Your network and data infrastructure is always evolving. So that VPN that may have worked in its current format 5 years ago, it needs to be updated. It's not always the VPN or the firewall. It's how it's constructed and implemented that I think sometimes manufacturing especially falls behind there.
Yeah, I think I don't want to pick on one industry any more than others, but I think manufacturing is tough because you're working on tight budgets. I've been in that environment in my career. You are also working in, commonly a different set of protocols that I think people, when they think about IT security, they immediately go right to that notebook on their desk and making sure that well-known operating system is patched, and away they go. And that's I think a lot of the lens of IT security is there. Manufacturing environment is different, proprietary protocols. You've got, PLCs and SCADAs, and you've got all these languages maybe that aren't they're not Microsoft products or they're not the Apple iOS or Android. And so that adds a level of complexity that I think makes it tough on folks in that environment. All the while they're trying to keep things up and running across a disparate set of systems. So it's a tough job. You're not just patching a notebook.
Yeah, and the focus, like you alluded to, it's always getting product out the door. That's focus
Right.
number one. How have you seen that dynamic play out in terms from an investment perspective? Have you seen the folks higher up in the organizations really embracing the fact that we need to invest in these types of products and protocols?
Yes, I think people are getting it. And I think there are so many, there are so many kind of popular media, public media. It used to be, right, you'd have to read maybe a specific security publication or listen to a podcast or a webcast such as yours. But you can go to any large news media outlet these days, right, and read about big cyber events. And so I think that has certainly elevated the attention paid to it. And we see more and more large organizations and smaller organizations taking the steps to put people in those jobs. But it's still, in many, many cases, it's someone that's wearing three hats. I think in smaller organizations, I'm not running into a dedicated chief information security officer, right? I'm running into somebody that runs ops. They keep the network going, and oh, by the way, they're also running. They're in charge of security. So in those cases, we are seeing them bring in outsourced talent as well. But it's moving downstream, but it's still not where it needs to be. And I think just my last comment on that, if you think that you're immune to this because of the size of your company, it's just not true, right? I have seen these incidents happen in very small manufacturers, in very large manufacturers, in every industry vertical, right? We can all pull these out of the press. So thinking that you're too small of a target is just not real. You have to take the steps to do this. And that might mean if you don't have the skills in-house, then hire a third party to manage some of this for you.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And we can't say that enough in terms of you got to ignore your size or your location in the supply chain. You'll get found. The hackers understand how all this is fitting together. And you're doing a great job of segueing into all the stuff I want to talk about here. One of the big topics, too, is finding these OT security folks. I think the IT side of it definitely has a need for more and more security people, but on the OT side, it's an even greater need.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen anything in terms of what enterprises have done to try to address these needs? Whether it is, like you said, going to a third party, trying to train from within, or is it just continuing the effort and try to get the word out there on what we need?
Well, I think broadly, right, there's just such a shortage of security professionals overall. So I see that in every single industry vertical. And I think the OT space is no different. So while I don't have deep expertise in that like you do, what I do see from our customers that are specifically deploying our readers and devices in those settings is they're commonly building that talent from within. And so they're building that talent from within, and then they'll add a third party over the top to assist. And that's what I see as an effective thing is build those skills internally, but then add a little bit of extra domain expertise from a third party on top of that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the bad guys. But before we do that, let's talk about the good guys. David, maybe you can fill us in a little bit on some of the things RFIDs are up to and what you guys focus on.
So the company started with a really simple idea, as a lot of successful companies do. So we've been at this more than 25 years now, and we started with this really simple idea of take that ID badge that we all wear on our way to work and at work, and do something more with it than open a door. And so what that was is start to automate workflows. Started in healthcare, but now we are in some of the largest manufacturers of the world, smaller ones as well, leveraging that ID credential to get people into their workflows. So think of taking your badge or some other credential, which may, like I said, could be a fob or a pendant, but it's typically still a badge, particularly in a manufacturing setting, and tap it to our reader. and that authenticates you to go do something. And ideally, then we're also adding a second factor. So a lot of our devices will also deploy a fingerprint reader in combo. So I can read that ID badge and then also touch and do a fingerprint simultaneously. So you get two-factor. Now I trust who that person is and I allow them to go do that operation. And that not only eliminates, all that fumbling of passwords all day long, but it also verifies that I have someone trained in what they're about to go do. So we have manufacturing customers that are in highly regulated industries where they need to prove who was that did that, very important function. Or we have partners in the manufacturing space that just have found it's a great way to reduce scrap. Because before I go do a complex, we have a business customer that does a chemical process. And while it's not volatile in the sense, but it's one that if they mix a bad batch, they have tens of thousands of dollars of scrap. So what they found is if they verify that it's a trained operator by tapping their badge to the panel before they kick off that process, they can eliminate that scrap. So that's that efficiency thing that we get into, that making sure it's a trained operator before you let them go do something. If they're in a regulated industry, you get that in addition to it. And overall, you have that layer of security. So we really thrive in these efficient, secure, and then in many cases, regulated environments. But it all starts with leveraging that identity badge, tap to one of our readers.
Well, you bring up a couple really interesting technologies there, and I can appreciate all the different applications there and how that could help in the short term and the long term. I'll just throw a couple of objections that I know, not necessarily even our audience, but the audience that they need to get these technologies into the hands of would kind of come back with you. With the biometric stuff, I think some of the issues there for manufacturing are, man, I'm in a dirty environment in some cases. It's a little bit more expensive. This is an extra step in terms of swiping the card, and I just want to get going. How do you respond to some of those, I guess, criticisms?
Well, I would say I agree on the reality of some of the biometric technologies, depending on the environment. Conversation I had with, a foundry, right? They're not going to have a fingerprint sensor in a foundry setting. But what that customer did is they embedded an ID card, the important part of it, into their gloves. So they are literally tapping their glove to a panel to kick off an operation. So people find creative ways to use that second factor. So they can, verify I am who I say I am by, touching that glove with an embedded sensor into that work environment. So that's, going back to where we originally came from, we had all these healthcare professionals that were all day long user ID password. And the motion for them was barely say hello to that patient. Instead, turn around, turn your back to them and fumble at a keyboard, then hopefully turn around and say hello. They became so much more efficient and they had a better patient experience. In this setting, we're also talking about just being so much more efficient in using that badge to tap it and get into that application and let you go. One of the largest industrial manufacturers in the world uses our technology. And I was sitting with the IT and security leader of that space. And he said, I don't call it an ID badge anymore. I call it a productivity badge, because they use that in the office space to pull a print securely. So they tap their badge to one of our readers that's on a print, retrieves it from a secure print queue. So you make sure you know who got that document. Then if they're on the shop floor, they're using that same badge to let them into a robotic work cell. And that makes sure that they protect who gets in there. So yes, I hear the user ID password stuff can really slow them down. So what we've done is say, okay, let's take that and let's turn that into a secure credential, can still be physical, that lets them go do their job.
Oh, very interesting. So I want to circle back a little bit, David, and talk about the bad guys just a little bit, because when we talk about this evolution in terms of the attack surface, cybersecurity, how we're trying to get people more involved, one of the more interesting things that illustrates how the hackers have evolved are the growth of these initial access brokers. These are the folks that basically specialize in stealing the credentials. They're going to pass it along to somebody else to really do the damage. What are some of the things you've seen there in terms of the growth of these IABs, the impact, and maybe some specific defensive measures companies are taking against them?
Yeah, I'm not a subject matter expert on the IABs per se. So my answer there is I would just defer back to it's about protecting against phishing and having passwords that are not phishable. So then I go to passwordless technology. But I'm not an expert in the identity access broker marketplace. We can all read about that and many stolen passwords. So I immediately go to something that can't be stolen. And so whether that's a physical card with encrypted credentials on it, or go to a virtual version of that that's behind a fingerprint or face ID, and then finally going to something like a FIDO credential, which is you only have half of it even if you steal it.
So going on a couple other just bigger sort of general topics, right now impacting industrial cybersecurity, there's probably no way we could have gotten through any episode right now without talking about a little bit about artificial intelligence and the impact it's having. We know how the bad guys are using it and some of those phishing schemes you just mentioned. What are some of the more practical applications for us on the good side in protecting a lot of that login and credential information and using AI?
Well, I think, yeah, you're right. Right. The clunky old phishing emails are probably a thing of the past. We always used to be able to count on the the grammar errors, the misspellings. We know that AI can help people write very convincing notes. So I think to start with, first of all, I mean, I think we can use that to help us with our own internal phishing campaigns. So that's one thing that we do we see people doing throughout their businesses is using those tools to create better campaigns internally and try to raise security awareness and tell people, look, you're not going to get a clunky phishing email anymore. It may be a very well written note that's going to come your way. That's probably one thing about AI. I think also our industry can start to think about using whether it's AI, and I know that term gets stretched, but start to think about attacks and think about the way patterns are developing. And if you're analyzing that, if something looks unusual, you can do that in a way you couldn't do that before.
So another sort of big picture trend that we're seeing right now, David, is a lot more state-sponsored hacktivists, if you will, getting involved, especially when it comes to credential stealing. We're seeing some stuff. I think it came out today. Lockbit is claiming they were able to actually hack into the DoD and steal some stuff there. What does that mean to you when you start seeing a lot more of these international countries, some of our enemies, if you will, folks we're not getting along with right now, really putting more and more energy into coming after our infrastructure, and that's going to lead to manufacturing potentially down the line?
Yeah, I won't make any kind of global geopolitical commentary. That's definitely not my expertise in this world, but I think it just confirms for all of us how vital it is that these are very serious actors that are potentially coming for your company assets. And we all play a role in, infrastructure, supply chain. It's vital that we do the things we need to do around secure credentials, things that aren't phishable, making workflows as secure as possible. Because like I said before, it's not just, you referenced it, it's not just the DoD, it's all of us that need to be taking steps to protect our enterprise and know that these aren't from, long, long ago. I've been in around this industry for 25 years, right? It's an entirely different type of person these days that's launching that attack. And so we have to equip our businesses, we need to equip our customers with serious tools, secure credentials, ways to and ways to let them use them, right? If I go back to where we live, is we help our customers use these secure credentials in a way that is easier for them to do it, so they use them. If we sit and we make passwords so difficult and getting into our workstations so difficult, that's when you see behaviors pop up where people try to circumvent it. And so if we can take a secure credential and make it an easy, efficient workflow for someone on the factory floor, that just means they're going to use it. And that is the best thing we can do to protect against some of these serious, bad actors that are out there, is try to do our part by making these things as secure and efficient as possible.
No, very well said. David, just sort of wrapping things up here a little bit. This has been great. A lot of great insight here. Any other trends you're seeing that might affect the industrial cybersecurity market over the next, we'll call it 12 to 18 months or so?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the full kind of list of what are the most likely things to occur, kind of bottom up, right? There's zero-day attacks that are happening. There's malwares out there. We know that. But from the top down, it's still so much of it is password. What's the number? 95% of all attacks still start with password. So I know maybe people get tired of talking about it, but I think if we start there, if we sort our top priorities, it's attacking that problem and getting people a way to more efficiently do their job that's passwordless, or at least a very secure credential, ideally a second factor on top of that. I think that's where we start chopping away at it. So maybe what's old is still here. It hasn't gone away yet. Let's continue to pound away at that problem. Because the other things are still out there as well. Like I said, right, we can't plant a flag and say we fixed that because something else will be there right behind it. But as a business, we're really fundamentally focused on that part, right? It's securely getting people into that workflow. That's where we spend our time. There are others that are trying to, fix the malware problem and other things like that. We're trying to make sure it's a trusted person that gets into that application that's about to do that job.
Thanks, David. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check him out at rfideas.com. And thank you for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, ien.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For David Cottingham, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.